A History of Medieval Westbourne. The area of Westbourne Green, where the church of St Mary Magdalene and the Grand Junction now stand, is often overlooked in histories of London. For almost a millennium, before it was drawn into the urban sprawl of the capital, Westbourne had a long and largely forgotten history as a distinct hamlet in the county of Middlesex. Nowadays, Westbourne Green is situated within the parish of Paddington, nestled to the south of the Grand Union Canal and the Westway, and is somewhat overshadowed by the modern-day prominence of other medieval rural villas that once were its neighbours: Paddington, Kensington, Knightsbridge and Marylebone. But originally, long before it subsumed into London and into the Metropolitan Borough of Paddington in 1900, it was a distinct settlement and a thriving community. Over the past 200 years, the village of Westbourne has been split apart and built over by the Grand Union Canal, the Westway, and the Great Western Railway, completely obscuring its former geography. For centuries, it had been a well-frequented village on the crossroads of the Harrow Road and Black Lion Lane, which headed directly south to Hyde Park. It was within a manorial hinterland spread across modern-day wards of Westbourne, Maida Vale and Harrow Road. Surprisingly, the manor of Westbourne had included most of the 20th century borough of Paddington, comprising both the land north and south of the canal. Casual historians of London will also perhaps be unaware that Westbourne never actually formed part of the manor of Paddington, but for most of its history formed part of the manor of Knightsbridge cum Westbourne. Consequently, Westbourne's individual history has never been comprehensively studied. Westbourne in the Dark Ages. It is possible that Anglo-Saxon tribes had inhabited the upper banks of the Westbourne Valley earlier in the first millennium AD, but it was only in a charter of 959 AD that a settlement in the region was first recorded. This document confirmed a grant of various parcels of land from King Edgar to the Bishop of London, including an unspecified grant at Paddington. In 1042, this landholding was specified to comprise a modest 2 hides of land, enough land for 2 peasant families to live off self-sufficiently for a year. Sometime around 998 AD, another manuscript was written and sealed by Athelred II, stating that the western boundary of this estate fell on the Westbourne stream. This confirmation of estates only referenced the praetorium of Paddington, which was granted to a lieutenant named Wulfric, but it suggested that the region across the river, later named as Westbourne, comprised a separate and distinct community. Nowadays, these 2 10th century documents are suspected to be forgeries made by monks of Westminster Abbey in the 12th century to help them claim lands in the region. It is therefore very difficult to draw any conclusions as to the human geography of the region before the Norman conquests. Very few details from the settlement at Westbourne survive from this era, but it's evident from its name and the wording of that questionable charter of 998 that Westbourne, or Westburn as it was often written, lay to the west of the stream that ran from Hampstead to the Thames near Chelsea. This river, which was also known as the Kilburn or Bayswater at other points in its course, ran down modern-day Shirland Avenue to Bayswater and onto the Thames. No medieval maps of the region survive to this day, but the earliest printed maps of Middlesex by John Norden in 1593 and John Speed in 1612 depict Westbourne on the west of the river, with Paddington lying immediately to the east. Curiously, neither Westbourne nor Paddington appear in the 1086 survey of landholdings known as the Domesday Book. At the time of the Norman conquests, the region appears to have been rural and sparsely populated, with the nearest recorded settlements being Liston to the east, Harlesden and Willesden to the north, and Kensington and Marylebone to the south. None of these settlements had more than 30 recorded households. It may well be that Westbourne did not feature because it was entirely uninhabited at the time. But it seems possible that, like other absent villas of Paddington and Knightsbridge, Westbourne fell under the control of other estates and was therefore not recorded separately. Pamela Taylor concludes that these 3 parishes were almost certainly part of Westminster Abbey's estates in 1086. If they had been in other hands, she says, they would have had their own entries, like neighbouring Eye, Kensington and Chelsea. Indeed, the Abbey's own return of 13.5 hides of land was certainly too large to include just the region immediately outside the Abbey, and suggested that distant manors such as Westbourne were included in its estate. A century later, in 1157, Westminster Abbey's estates in Middlesex were said to include only Westminster, Knightsbridge, Paddington, Tothill and the Vale of Eye, with no reference to Westbourne. But it should not be presumed that Westbourne did not exist at this time. In 1330, it is revealed that Westbourne was officially termed the hamlet of Knightsbridge, which lay 2 miles downstream. It may well be that a settlement had existed at Westbourne for many years previously, but had only been considered part of the neighbouring estate. This situation, whereby Westbourne formed a manor alongside Knightsbridge, continued into the 19th century, and has often obscured Westbourne's own history. Given that Knightsbridge itself was a hamlet, this was a somewhat unusual relationship, which led to the small settlement of Westbourne being subsumed into the administrative history of its southern neighbour. Yet while these two districts may appear distant from each other to modern-day Londoners, the two hamlets were then separated by just a mile of farmland and the Uxbridge Road. Knightsbridge, of course, was also named after a bridge on the Westbourne stream, a mile downriver from Westbourne, and it was not until 1536 that Hyde Park was created on the land in between the two. Westbourne enters the historic record, the 13th to 16th centuries. It was not until 1222 that the name Westbourne first conclusively appears in the written record, in a royal decree which referred to a settlement distinct from Paddington. This decree, written in Latin, concluded that the districts of Knightsbridge, Westbourne and Paddington, with its chapel and their appurtenances, belonged to the parish of St Margaret. From this brief reference, it is apparent that a settlement by the name of Westbourne existed for some time previously, and had become part of Westminster Abbey's parish of St Margaret after the church of that name was built beside the abbey in the 12th century. But unlike neighbouring Paddington, Westbourne did not have a church of its own, and would not do so until modern times. Therefore, dutiful worshippers from the settlement would have had to travel 4 miles to the abbey's own church of St Margaret, or more likely to neighbouring Paddington. It is probably for this pragmatic reason that Westbourne came to be considered part of Paddington parish. The first evidence of this convention dates from 1452, when landing Westbourne, called Dorbury Shot, is stated to be within the parish of Paddington. However, in terms of its secular administration, the village or hamlet of Westbourne remained part of Knightsbridge Manor for centuries to come. Thus, when at some point around 1550 Edward VI dissolved the bishopric of Middlesex, Paddington was removed from St Margaret's parish and became a parish in its own right as part of the See of London. Therefore, the parish of St Margaret's came to consist just of the Knightsbridge region of the composite manor of Knightsbridge and Westbourne. Confusingly, it appears that the village of Westbourne had thus become part of the parish of Paddington, but on a secular level it remained part of Knightsbridge Manor. From subsequent records, the economic and social life of Westbourne begins to emerge from obscurity. In 1295, Westbourne was included in a list of hamlets in the region, which Abbot Walter of Wenlock deposed were under the authority of clergymen of Westminster. The abbey, he claimed, had been granted by Henry III to regulate the tolls, jails, markets, fairs, and coroners in these estates, and had charters to prove it. According to a later tithe dispute, the same abbot had purchased several swathes of land in Westbourne on his own behalf before conceding them to the abbey, cementing the church's interest in the area. 13 acres were purchased from John Le Taylor, while a similar amount was obtained from 2 noblewomen, 11 acres from Matilda Arnold and 2 acres from Juliana Bailesbull. Westbourne may have become part of the composite manor with Knightsbridge, but it was by no means subsumed by its larger and more prominent neighbour. Knightsbridge had held manorial courts since 1257, but over the subsequent 2.5 centuries, Westbourne rarely featured in the court's proceedings. However, from 1511, the court rules officially titled the manor as Knightsbridge cum Westbourne, and split entries into sections for each of Knightsbridge and Westbourne, testifying to the importance of Westbourne within the manor. This court oversaw numerous disputes involving the residents of the village, often centering on disputed land rights and petty crimes or civil disagreements. As was the way with medieval land enclosures, the delimitation of the land in the area had many other complexities. Records show that a portion of the land in Westbourne was considered to be part of the manor of Marylebone, belonging to Robert Stillington, Bishop of Bath and Wells in the 15th century, and was granted to new holders in 1498. In another instance, in the 1450s, the lord of the manor of Chelsea received 60 shillings per year from Richard Hurlock for land in Westbourne, suggesting that a detached portion of the land belonged to the manor of Chelsea. And, in a separate document from 1598, we are told that the farm of Westbourne, of Robert Coram and Roger Coram, was held directly from the Queen. This land was described as 1/40th part of a knight's fee, perhaps around 100 acres, and seems to refer to the farm to the southeast of the Westbourne crossroads, seen on later maps. The earliest surviving plans of Paddington Estate show that in 1742 portions of the land to the west and south of Westbourne Green were still in the possession of the Paddington Rectory, which lay a mile to the east. Yet while these land rights were complex, the everyday life of the tenants who rented them were evidently far simpler. The records demonstrate a little recorded history of Westbourne functioning as a small medieval agricultural settlement, under the control of the noble and religious landlords. In the 16th century, the manor courts show that the peasant tenants of Westbourne were expected to pay 21 pence annually for their common land, rising to 22 pence in 1636. This was about a third of the amount the more numerous tenants of Knightsbridge paid for their common land. The right to graze cattle on Westbourne's land was fiercely defended by the residents in these manor courts, and were evidently central to the hamlet's small economy. In 1584, the inhabitants of neighbouring Kensington were ordered not to graze their cattle on Westbourne's common land, and fines for such activity were imposed in the courts in 1566 and 1616. Tudor Westbourne. Although small pockets of land were held by various gentlemen in the early medieval period, the vast majority of the land at Westbourne and the manor itself remained in the possession of Westminster Abbey throughout this era. The settlement's small population of a few dozen families would have farmed the fertile land of the valley for their own subsistence, paying tithes to clergymen and gentlemen who owned the land. Most of these tithes, which were paid in grain and other agricultural produce, would have presumably been taken back to Westminster Abbey, where they would have fed the monastic communities there. However, this centuries-old institution was brought to an end under the reign of Henry VIII, when the king broke from the authority of Rome and instituted the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1540s. With these events, the church's centrality to Westbourne's history was curtailed, and the land was taken away from the church's possession and granted to privileged gentlemanly landlords. The revenues of Knightsbridge and Westbourne, totalling £2 6 shillings and 8 pence, were alienated to the crown, while the lands of Knightsbridge, Kensington, and Westbourne were separately valued at £5 14 shillings and 11 pence. Both figures were relatively modest compared to the £31 6 shilling and 8 pence valuation that the manor of Paddington was given, demonstrating the small size of these rural communities. After existing for centuries as a modest community of tenant farming families, the rural village of Westbourne was now on the verge of changing forever. London's population would swell from 40,000 people in the year 1500 to around 575,000 in the year 1700, pulling the distant hamlet into its sphere. Early modern Westbourne, lying on a crossroads of the well-travelled Harrow Road as it began to wind its way through London's hinterland, would become an increasingly well-frequented place of leisure, work, and habitation on the fringes of the city for the next few centuries, until the arrival of the canal, railway, and the urban swell of London.